Well, happy Wednesday, everyone. Thank you for coming back and joining us as we continue in our Wednesday studies. And we are in Daniel chapter 1. And last week we kind of got into a little bit of the first chapter. And of course, we had the break for the 4th of July holiday, so I'm glad to have you all back and hope you're enjoying this. This is going to be very interesting as we go into some nuances of the book of Daniel that maybe you weren't aware of. And so, as you notice on your screen, you're going to see a scan from a Hebrew version of the book of Daniel, and I have highlighted where we pick up today. And the translation reads very similar to the King James that you may be a little more familiar with. And it says, and they should teach that he should teach them. And remembering this was Daniel and the three other Hebrew children, which we will go through their names a little bit later. But these four were picked because they were exhibiting wisdom and knowledge, fairer to look on, conducted themselves more properly than and many of the other ones were, and somehow they got the attention of the king and his team, and they were selected. And so here is where they're going to go with this, what's in store for them for being selected. And so the main thing is that they have to teach them the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. So here's where we get into some interesting opportunities to try to put ourselves in the mindset of where they were. Again, for us living in the Midwest, in this Western culture, having so many different versions of the Bible, but mainly reading it in the English. We lose sight of the understanding that these were people who didn't speak English. They lived in the Middle East, and Daniel and the ones that were taken to captivity did not speak the language of the land that they were being taken to. Daniel, um, we understand, knew Hebrew, but he also knew another language called Aramaic. And but what he didn't know is the language of the Chaldeans. And so part of this training was to help them assimilate into the culture by learning the language. And so they had to learn the language or the tongue of the Chaldeans. What we will find as we go through the book of Daniel is that the majority of the Hebrew Bible was written in the language Hebrew, of course. That's why it's called the Hebrew Bible. But there are portions that are not written in Hebrew. There are portions that are written in Aramaic. And Daniel is one of the books that has a large portion of it written in Aramaic. When we get to chapter 4, verse 7, is where the language changes in the Bible from Hebrew to Aramaic. And so this will be a great opportunity for myself because I'm, obviously trying to learn Hebrew, spending a lot of time on that, but also working towards the goal of learning Aramaic. And so this will be a way to jumpstart me and move me more in this direction and try to share that with you. The importance there for me is that the language of Aramaic is understood to be the language that Jesus and disciples spoke, um, and that the early church was familiar with in the book of Acts. Again, sometimes we just have to remind ourselves that they lived in an area where they were multicultural, multinational, and multilingual. They weren't even bilingual, they were multilingual because there were so many dynamics happening in their culture that they were influenced by many different areas. So the disciples spoke Aramaic as their main language. Hebrew was the ceremonial language that was spoken in the synagogues, in the temple, in their morning prayers. In fact, there are still some morning prayers in the Hebrew prayer book that are written in Aramaic. because of this influence. And so Aramaic is somewhat of a, it's also called a holy tongue. The Jews have a special name for Hebrew, being the Holy Tongue, but Aramaic is also called the Holy Tongue because of its use way back in Genesis, its use in Ezra, its use in Daniel. And so it's very exciting, and also its use in um, the time of Jesus, the when Jesus spoke to the multitudes, it's understood and believed that he spoke to them in Aramaic. The Greek came along a little bit later as the foreign nations outside of the realm of Judaism were then being witnessed to, being proselytized and converted to Christianity. Then Paul spoke in their language. The apostles who were ministering to them spoke in their language, which was Greek. But yet, even in those areas where they spoke Greek, there was still a very strong influence of the Aramaic. And so, again, scholars think a lot in both different directions. It used to be that they thought that Jesus spoke Greek, but now they've learned that he spoke Aramaic. And so, again, the point here is we're not going to solve that mystery, but we can know that we can look at the Aramaic, which is more closely related to the Hebrew, and just try to get an understanding of what they were thinking, what Jesus was thinking when this was spoken. And so that's my personal quest to learn Aramaic, and by going into Daniel, will kind of push me stronger in that way. So I'll be happy to share that with you as we go through. So Daniel and his friends were needing to learn you know, go move from Aramaic and Hebrew into the language of the Chaldeans. And so the king was setting them up to do that. And then, of course, along with that, he was trying to really influence them and assimilate them. And so he was giving them a daily portion of the king's food, a portion of the wine which he drank, and they were to be that he drank, and they should be nourished for 3 years. So think of this. This was 3 years to learn the Chaldean language, learn everything about um, the king and his form of government, learn everything about the culture, in that at the end of these 3 years, that they might be able to stand before the king. This was no small task. This was something, their life may have depended upon them passing this test and satisfying the king. You can imagine that he wouldn't be very happy with them if at the end of 3 years he invested all of this time, all of this money into them, and they failed. They didn't learn the language. They didn't learn all of the culture. They didn't understand how they should behave. If he quizzed them, which it seems like there'd be a test here coming up, and they failed, this could be very bad for them. So there's a lot of pressure on them, and we'll see how this plays out as we go further. So now that you have the setting taken from the Hebrew commentators, um, we're just going to come down a little bit here and want to look at a couple of the words that we're going to come across, the daily portion, and then the word for food that they're using here is very different than I've seen in the rest of the Hebrew Bible that I've been reading, which normally the word is ochal, but here it's the word pathbag. And so the commentators notice it, and they notice that this was mm, most likely tied into not just the food choices of the king, but the whole kingdom and the religious system that is there were very much intermeshed. And so the food of the king could very well have been sacrificed to idols beforehand. It could have been special type of meat and other delicacies it uses here that were known to be pleasing to the gods that um, and with small g, the gods that the king served, and be very tied in with this. And so you can think that this might have caused some issue for Daniel and his friends. So with that thought in mind, let's go back to the um, Bible Hub that we have here and take a look at these Hebrew words just a little bit closer. So we're picking up that Behekal HaMelech, that in the palace of the king, um, Ula Lamed, they might teach, comes from the word lamed, to teach, and then it uses the word sefer, translated as language, but the word sefer mainly means a book. And so this is kind of important because as you're looking through some Hebrew, you may see the word sefer being used, and this is what you will see their books called. And so just something to be aware of, that this is a word, if you start doing any studies in Judaism or in Hebrew, you're going to see this word sefer being used a lot. It's used to describe the holy books that they study. It's used to describe the Torah scroll. Sometimes it will be called a sefer. And so it's just a very important word to learn that you'll come across. And here it's translated language, but it's mainly that the king wanted these Hebrew children to be taught the books and the literature. Lashon here, it says literature, but it really stands for the language. Lashon is the tongue, meaning the language of the Chaldeans. So he wanted them to learn all about um, eh, the culture, all about the language. And it says in verse 5 here that Vaiman, he appointed Lachem unto them, Hamelech, Davar Yom, a daily provision. Now, you'll notice from when we look back at these other words here that this daily is called the daily portion. You'll see that they didn't even translate this, and it's almost like a double translation. It's Davar Yom and then Bayom Mo, um, Mipat Bag. And so you see daily is mentioned twice. This word provision here is the word davar, which can mean many different things, but it usually means words that are near and dear to the heart, words that are important. I'm trying to bring this up, but my screen and my internet is very slow today. So, but at Devar, and you've heard me speak about this before, that these are words from the heart. So what the king is saying to them, breaking this apart a little bit more than what the Hebrew sages said, is he would give them a word of the day, kind of like some of us may subscribe to inspirational quotes of the day, or if you're learning Spanish, you get a Spanish word of the day, or Hebrew word of the day, or Aramaic word of the day. I get all three of those. And so just something to keep building upon. So here would be, I believe, that the king would have a word for them of every day, and then uh, Beyo Mo, he would have daily provision. And here's where we get this delicacy. I'm just going to unclick this and hope I can get to it quickly without just taking too long trying to come up on the screen. Um, Unfortunate here that we got a slow internet connection. Okay, here we go. Pathbag would be a portion or delicacies. Again, it's called translated as choice food. You see, it's only used 6 times in the Bible, and it's all here we see it only in the book of Daniel. So that's where we get the understanding that this wasn't just food that the Hebrew children were used to. These had to do with special things for the king, and that it was part of the reconditioning, the reprogramming of them from Judaism into a pagan lifestyle, a pagan form of worship, eating the foods dedicated to the king and the pagan gods. So this wasn't only, the food, it was the wine that he drank, and then the training for these 3 years so they could stand before the king. And so, with that thought in mind, this is going to be really challenging, and this is going to cause some problems. And of course, as the narrative continues here in verse 6, it takes a pause. So it's almost like they want you to think about that a little bit, and think about what's happening here, and look at the people themselves. And so here we get to find out who is the main focus of this story. And Vayhi Vahem, among those, the B'nai, or sons of Yehuda, first is Daniel, then there's Anya, and then there's Mishael, and then there's Azazara. So these are their names. Will learn them later because in the Bible stories, we heard of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Well, these are their names before the king renamed them. And so, in order to just take a look at that, we're going to look down at the um, sages, what they have here, and they do it very nicely, greater than I can do. And so, of course, the name Daniel, we have looked at before. It would be a judge, uh, judging from God. Then the next one is Hananiah. This name is found in the Akkadian Aramaean, well supported actually in the book of Tobit. Again, it's interesting here that they are quoting a book which has been somewhat controversial. Those of you who may use a Catholic Bible will notice that the book of Tobit is there. Hebrew Bibles do not include it as part of their canon, and the Protestant Bibles do not include it as part of their canon, but the Hebrews will use it for reference. And so here it is mentioned in apocryphal books. The next one we get is Mishael, and it means one, um, meaning who is what God is, meaning who is like God. Again, a very beautiful name here. And then we get Azariah, which is God is my help. Gives some references in Jeremiah and Exodus where there are some others who had names like that. And so here is, again, an explanation that they were given names um, on top of their Hebrew names, and they were expected to use these different names. Um, Daniel was given a different name called Belteshazzar, and it's in the Chaldean language meant to protect his life. It was reference to the Babylonian gods, perhaps the god named Bel. Um, and then, of course, we have to Shadrach, to the name was given. We really don't know the meaning. It's Assyrian, it's obscure. They give a little bit of understanding of what it could have meant. Then Meshach is also unknown derivation, and it might conceal the name of a Babylonian deity. Remember, that was the whole purpose, was to get them to think differently, get them to convert over to um, this lifestyle that they were going to be living in as part of a Chaldean. And then Abednego, here it says that Nego may be somewhat a slight different version of the word Nebo, which would mean a servant of Nebo, because Aved means servant. And then, so again, even some different influences they even mention in the Christian era. Kind of interesting how the Hebrew Bible will, and commentators will speak about Christian times and talk about them because uh, they're a reference. They're a very real reference, and it means a lot to include that to give credence to the names that are there and provide a historical background for that. So I think that's where we're going to stop today. We're going to pick up next week when we see what they're going to do. And of course, those of us that maybe want to read ahead and see how they're going to handle this. They're in a tough spot. They're being given what most people would consider are a great privilege, a great honor bestowed upon um, wealth and riches and all the food they can want, the best food of the land, the best teachings of the land, but yet it's going to cause them to potentially compromise their relationship with God. It's going to try to change them from who they are and what their identity is as as Israelites and as servants of the Most High God, go against everything they've been taught since they were children. And how are they going to react to that? How are they going to stand up, or are they going to give in, or how is God going to work through them and in this whole situation? So, hope you enjoyed that probably long introduction to this, but tune in next week as we see how they're going to react. So, God bless you all. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week. Bye bye.